Welcome into the Jazz Notes podcast. I'm Ben Anderson.
I'm Chandler Holt.
We are recording this on June 4th. We are a little more than 3 weeks away from the NBA draft, so exciting news there. I guess 3 weeks from tomorrow. So it's going to be here quick. I will talk about the NBA draft a little bit, some of the different player options. We're certainly transitioning into that. We'll do so over the next 3 weeks as we lead up to it. We will get into some weekly news coming up here in the second segment and also answer your mailbag questions. As always, find us on Twitter at Ben's Hoops. Read us, find us at Chandler Holt KSL, and read us at KSLSports.com. Also, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, Threads, wherever you get your news, we've got it at KSL Sports. So we appreciate you following us there. And subscribe to the Jazz Notes mailbag. You can find it in any article. You can always in the description of this podcast, wherever you're getting it. There's a link to it. So subscribe, get early access to our Q&A, Jazz Notes, different jazz stories before they actually hit the website. So a very cool opportunity there. All right, Chandler, though, before we move on to some of this draft and weekly news stuff, let's finish off our player reviews. We've been doing this for, a month and a half now, and rightfully so. We've reached, I don't want to say the bottom of the barrel with all due respect to these guys, but kind of the other four players that were on the roster that just kind of filled out the back end of the roster for the Utah Jazz. Those players are, of course, Johnny Juzang, Micah Potter, Omer Yurtseven, and Luka Šamanić.
Yes, so who do you want to start with first?
Let's start with Luka Šamanić.
Okay, I like that. Luka this year played 43 games, most games he's ever played in a season. Started in 7, only averaged about 9 minutes per game, but that's just because he was sort of a, like you said, end of rotation guy to start the year. Later in the year, he got a lot more opportunity. For his season stats, 4.1 points a game, 2.4 rebounds, shot only 38% from the floor, 20% from 3, about 79% from the line.
He is an unrestricted free agent this offseason. I don't think he's going to be back.
Okay.
And this is what as I'm getting ready for the draft, I'm like looking at all these guys, and like you get really intrigued by these guys' bodies. Luka has a perfect NBA body. Like, it's crazy. His size, his athleticism, like we know he can jump out of the gym. He's really strong. He likes dunking on people. He gets downhill. 6'10", 230 with that athleticism. I get why you would take a chance on him.
Yep.
Totally makes sense. It just hasn't been there. It's just like the rest isn't there. The game isn't there. And he has flashes and he has some big games. And I know he had a good rebounding game, and Will Hardy really credited him for coming in and changing the pace for the Jazz and doing some of that. And they know each other from San Antonio where he was drafted. And I just haven't seen enough to get it over the finish line. He's been in the league for 3 years now. I'm just I need a little bit more if I'm convinced that he's going to be worth bringing back.
And looking at the last month of the season, looking at April, he was playing over 21 minutes a game, but he shoots 12% from 3.
Yeah.
Looking at his last couple games, 0 for 5, 0 for 3, 1 for 7, 1 for 3. And in those games, he scored double digits every single game. Against Houston, 22 points, adds 6 rebounds, 2 assists. And then the game before that has 15 points and 10 rebounds against Denver. But just the shooting isn't really there, and it's he isn't that good at getting downhill, getting to the cup to make up for the liability that he is from behind there.
And he hates passing.
Yep.
Which is hard. If you can't shoot, you shouldn't hate passing, and he hates passing. So that's the problem. It's just if he did one of the other things, I think it would be a lot easier to justify him being here and sticking around on the roster. If he shot 33% from 3 and there was a real potential that, hey, I think that jumps up to 38% next year, 35%, I can buy that. Or, you know what, he doesn't shoot, but he doesn't shoot the 3, but he's over 50% inside the arc, or really good at the rim. Well, he's not that either. And then it's well, maybe he's a good playmaker no, he doesn't do that either. It's just there's too many he doesn't actually do that. He's not a great defensive player. He doesn't go out and lock down guys. So I love the concept of him, and the body is insane, and the rest of it's just never developed. It's just never come around. And maybe that's hard for some of these guys. Some of these guys are all body, and that's how they get by in the NBA, and the skills never develop. Ochai Agbaji is a much better player than Luka Šamanić because at least he shoots threes, kind of.
Yes.
And plays defense, kind of. And Luka doesn't do those things. So I would suspect we've seen the last of Luka Šamanić in a Utah Jazz jersey. Again, unrestricted free agent. I bet he lands somewhere, but there was a reason he was in the G League and the Jazz were able to sign him for nothing.
Yes.
Good for him for sticking a year. He made an extra $2 million this year, so he's made some cash in his career.
Next up, Michael Potter. In 16 games for the Jazz this year, averaged about 3.3 points, 2.7 rebounds, blocked 0.4 shots, about 48% from the floor, 43% from three, and then 75% from the free throw line.
So Micah's the exact opposite of Luka in a really funny way. And Micah's like a great teammate, super personable. Like he and his wife are just like trying to make it in the NBA lifestyle. And if you, so this is just the hypothetical, like you're a fan of whatever team and they sign Micah Potter and you dial up his Jazz numbers and you're like, 16 games. He's 6'10". He shot 47% from the floor and 43% from three. Like, did we just get the steal of the offseason? And then you watch him play and you're just like, huh. Like, he's a nice guy. And like he can hit threes. Like that's a real skill. That's a swing skill for a lot of big guys in the NBA. And then there's still just like not quite enough there, right? And I don't know if at 25 years old, because he started his career at Ohio State and ended up at Wisconsin and kind of had a long college career. As old as he is now, I'm just not sure. He's 26 today already. It's like he's as old as Lowry Markkanen. Like, I just don't know if it's going to get there. Yeah. I just don't know if the timeline of his career has matched up with like his age, unfortunately. And he's done everything the Jazz have asked. Become a knockdown shooter. It's not what he did in college. And I still just like don't know if I buy it for him.
Yeah.
I don't know. Generally, when you see an NBA player, they jump. Like, it's obvious. And I don't see it enough with Micah. And maybe I'm missing something, and maybe the Jazz totally disagree, but he's at the end of his 2-year, two-way contract. Maybe he'll be on the Summer League team again, this superstar Summer League team that the Jazz are putting together. It's very possible. But he might be better off with a change of scenery with another team that could invest him a little bit.
Hey, he shot 58% from three in March.
No, it's crazy. Like, he's really good at that.
Yeah.
He tries to steal every rebound, which is funny. Like, he tries to rebound balls that aren't his to rebound. And you're like, oh, that's aggressive. It's like, no, John Collins is there.
Yeah.
Don't try and steal that. Like, that's the veteran's rebound. Like, he's a great teammate. All the boxes are checked. And still, I'm like, yeah, I don't know. And I think that's a bad sign, kind of. But I think he would do better on another team.
No, definitely. I think that rebounding is maybe one area that he could improve in, and it would make teams a lot more likely to take a chance on him. Maybe give him a little bit more opportunity. Like in the last game of the season, 10 points and 8 rebounds in 21 minutes. That's great. But then before that, he plays 21 minutes, only gets 5 rebounds. Plays 20 minutes against the Kings, get 4 rebounds. So yeah, I think that, and he's also sort of a small center. ESPN has him listed at 6'9". So yeah. Do you think he'll be here next year?
I don't.
Okay.
And I think because you're taking some end of the bench swings, and because he can't sign another two-way deal or won't sign another two-way deal here, it's like I would just go with Kenneth Lofton Jr.
Yep.
Or I would go with Omer Yurtseven again or something like that, who I think is just because their size is better. I might just prefer to do that over Micah, where all the numbers are good, and I hope he succeeds. I told you he's a really nice guy, but I just don't quite see it. Haven't quite seen it.
All right, let's do Omer Yurtseven next and save Johnny Juzang for last.
Okay.
Yurtseven played 48 games for the Jazz this year, started in 12, little under 12 minutes per game, averaged 4.6 points, 4.3 rebounds, about 54% from the floor, and just 0.4 blocks a game.
Has a partially guaranteed deal next year.
Okay.
He still is under contract with the Utah Jazz. That's one of the reasons why he did sign here. He's got to hit certain guarantee dates to be brought back, and he made all of them last year, which is why he's still on the roster. So he's got a real chance to make the team again next year, and totally fine. He's a third center. He's a sixth big. Like, you have your kind of swing wings, like your big wings that kind of can play forward in the front court. And then you've got your true big guys like Walker Kessler and John Collins and Lowry Markkanen. And then you have Omer Yurtseven at the end of that.
Yes.
And that's right where he fits. And that's fine. And he's good enough to be in that spot. And he's not good enough to be someone you play 82 minutes or 82 games a year for 20 minutes or 15 minutes. He's just not that good of a player. He does some things well. He's a change of pace guy. He's huge. He's a nice guy. And if the Jazz decide they didn't want to keep his deal around, they don't have to. And if the Jazz do want to keep his deal around, they can. And I don't think you blink an eye at it. You bat an eye.
Yeah, definitely. He had a few like really solid games this year.
Did.
Like against Denver in April, 20 points, 11 rebounds. Funny enough, no blocks but 2 steals. Shoots 9 for 14 in that game. And I think even like earlier in the season, he got some opportunities. Yes, against the Lakers in November, 18 points, 6 rebounds, also 73% from the floor in that game.
I wish I had better analysis other than he's your third center.
Yes.
And I know I've said that a little bit. It's just at this point, it's exactly who he is. His upside is not there. There's zero downside. He's 25 years old. He is exactly who he's going to be. There's a reason why Miami let him go and wasn't all that bothered by it. And the Jazz would do the same thing. But also, if he's back, you're fine with him being back next year. So nothing really that blows your socks off there in any regard for Omer Yurtseven.
His stats are kind of interesting. Like 4.6 points, 4.3 rebounds. I'm trying to see what his stats per 36 would be. Yeah, per 36, he's at about 15 points per game and 14 rebounds per game. So that's exactly what you want from a bench center.
Yep. He can start 5 games when your players are hurt and be replacement level. He's truly the most replacement level big guy, but, Jeff Withey was that before. I mean, Hassan Whiteside was that. Like, the league is actually, there are so many of those guys on the planet that are 7 feet tall, good enough, and because they're 7 feet tall, they're helpful. And you know what? 2 more coming every year. And I kind of like Zach Edey, but that might be exactly who Zach Edey is. I mean, those guys, it might be who Walker Kessler devolves into, where you had this high hope for him, but maybe he just doesn't get much better than he was as a rookie, and he never gets, to 15 and 12, and his career is 8-8 off the bench for $4 million to whichever next team. It just doesn't have a 7-footer.
Yep. Okay, last up here, Johnny Juzang. I thought he played more games than this, but he didn't. He played 20 games for the Jazz, started in 5. But also, I'm pretty sure we talked about this at one of our end-of-season episodes. Like, he's showing that he deserves a contract. Like, he played about 18, 19 minutes per game in his appearances, 7.2 points, 1.8 rebounds, 1.2 assists. The big thing, though, 41.6% from 3.
It is the really funny thing, again, going back to Micah Potter, where it's like, Micah hits all these same boxes, and you're like, not a chance.
Yep.
And then Johnny Juzang this, and you're like, give that guy a deal. Johnny Juzang's an NBA player. I'm totally with you, though. Yep. I agree. I mean, I just think Johnny Juzang, 60% effective field goal percentage. We, was it last week, 2 weeks ago, we did the Simone Fontecchio, like, oh, you gave up on that guy. It's like, that's kind of who Johnny Juzang is. Yep. And actually, Johnny tried a lot more defensively. He's not a good defensive player, but he's 22. He's significantly better now than he was coming out of UCLA.
Yes.
Like, a lot better. That's the type of, like, late, he's 22, but, like, kind of late development in a traditional player development plan that is like, oh, that's really intriguing, actually. He got better once he got to the league. And he ended up going undrafted, right? He signed with the Jazz on draft night.
Yes.
He did the 2-year, 2-way deal. I think he gets a guaranteed contract. I actually really do. He's just barely turned 23. Again, you just can't have enough 6'7" wings who shoot 40% from 3. Those guys just have a ton of value on your team. And, the Jazz didn't move on from Ochai Agbaji because Johnny Juzang was on the roster, but he could make you forget about Ochai Agbaji overnight if he continues to do this and does it at any realistic level for extended minutes. Like, if you can play him 15 minutes a night and he can knock down a 3 a game, really good. And then, like, there's the Sam Merrill upside. Like, can you just come in and be lights out, 40%, can't leave you open? If they leave you open, you're absolutely toast. You're absolutely dead. And that's just your entire role. And we don't need you to do anything else, which is actually kind of funny. I thought he showed a little bit more, a little ability to do a little bit more. He had some good rebounding games. He had some good passing games. But I'm intrigued by Johnny Juzang. Also probably going to be on the Jazz G League team or the Summer League team, which again is going to win every game by 48 points. They're going to go undefeated both in Salt Lake City and Las Vegas, and they're going to bring that trophy home. So excited to see that.
But yeah, Juzang in the month of April shoots 59% from 3.
Yeah.
And if you look at these, 50%, 2 for 4, 66%, 66%. And then he has his game against Golden State where he hits 7 of 8, 27 points. But yeah, you also mentioned some good rebounding and passing games. Grabs 7 rebounds against the Clippers. He has a lot of 3-4 rebound games. So yeah, I think that he definitely showed in only 20 games, funny enough, that he is worth some type of deal.
And even had some things like inside the paint that I liked, where I was like, oh, you've got a little more to your game as opposed to just like, I'm only threes, and if that doesn't work, I won't go inside the paint. Like, he actually dribbles a little bit. And if you remember, this was a few years ago now, But like he was a first-round pick coming out of UCLA had he left after they made the Final Four. And he says, I'm going to run it back. I want to chase the ring. They were terrible the next year. He wasn't as good, gets overshadowed by Jaime Jaquez a little bit, and goes undrafted.
Yep.
But at one point they were like, yeah, this is a first-round pick. And the Jazz got a guy who would have been a first-round pick had they taken him 2 years earlier for nothing the next year. And the nice thing is coming off of two-way deals, you're an automatic restricted free agent. So it's not like someone's going to come and blow the Jazz socks off with an offer that they can't match or just couldn't sign. He's a restricted free agent, so the Jazz have the opportunity to bring him back. That also applies to Micah Potter, by the way, so we should throw that note in. But I think Johnny Juzang is not only back, but like might play. Like if you told me in 3 years from now Johnny Juzang's a better player than Bryce Sensabaugh, I would say, yeah, sure.
Yeah,
the shooting came along, and Bryce's defense shooting never came along. But Johnny's is there. So intriguing, and I will tell you the Jazz spoke really highly of him all year long. Will Hardy was pretty effusive in his praise of Johnny. And even after the trade deadline, like right as it happened, we met with Justin Zanuck, the media did, and he's like, we want to see Taylor. We want to open up opportunities for Bryce. We want to see what Johnny Juzang can do. And there was like almost an audible like, Johnny Juzang? Like, you didn't trade Kelly Olynyk and Ochai to make room for Johnny Juzang, and what did they do? They played him a lot.
Yeah.
And he was good. So they were right. They actually were interested in him a little bit there, and it seems like it's paid off. So intrigued. Between the guys we talked about last week, specifically Kenneth Lofton Jr. and Johnny Juzang, I bet like one of those guys kind of hits next year. I bet one of those guys turns into like, again, not the next Simone Fontecchio, but like a fringe to top 8 rotation player who you rely on and is a part of the younger core here that you're working with.
I bet you, like you said, like funny enough, you compared Juzang and Bryce. I bet you they're competing for a similar bench role next season.
And I wouldn't be at all surprised if Johnny wins out.
Yeah,
because he's bigger. He's not the passer that Bryce Sensabaugh is, but not being able to impact the game without touching the ball is huge.
Yes.
It's why it's going to be hard for Kenneth Lofton to get on the floor. He has to touch the ball. Johnny Juzang can touch the ball without dribbling once and have a, what did you say, 7 of 8 shooting performance against Golden State? Like, how many dribbles do we think he took in that game? 5?
I was about to say some Klay Thompson
Fewer
numbers.
than shots. He took fewer dribbles than shots in that game. Almost guaranteed, other than like, hey, I was the secondary ball handler bringing the ball off the floor and getting it right back to Keontae or Jason Preston or whoever. Like, he has that type of impact. And those guys are just enormously valuable. So if that 41% three-point shooting is real, he's a catch. He's a good find. So, all right, that wraps it up. We've looked back at all of our Jazz players. That was a big project. Appreciate everybody who listened. And then you've been writing up kind of some recaps on these players from every season. So go find those at KSLSports.com. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we will jump into the mailbag. Stick around. More Jazz Notes coming up next. Welcome back to the Jazz Notes podcast. All right, let's get into the mailbag. Appreciate you always following us on Twitter at Ben's Hoops, at Chandler Holt KSL, and of course at KSLSports.com. Let's jump in. We'll go quickly with Jason Shepard. He says, I would like the whole mailbag to be about the rebrand. I need the deets. I think that's a common refrain from Jazz fans. I don't have any updates as of today. I would expect to have news much sooner than later. I don't know what that means exactly, but the draft coming up a little more than 3 weeks from now, the Jazz are going to want to have some of that branding done. I know they're busy with hockey as well, so I would expect we have probably close to a final product, if not a final product, coming up very, very soon for you Utah Jazz fans. All right, Jake, the Lynx. If the Jazz were trading for a good player that they want, and they would greatly improve the roster, but the other team demands one of our good young players back in the trade, who would you pick to include? Keontae George, Walker Kessler, or Taylor Hendricks? It's hard to pick, obviously. It's going to depend on what the other team's needs are. I would tell you the value right now. I'm really curious about this, in all honesty. I think it's an interesting question. I talked about in the last time I was on the podcast, or I guess I should say 2 weeks ago, that the Jazz had turned down including Keontae George in a trade for DeJounte Murray. And I have no idea how far down the road those talks actually got, but I know I'd been told that a trade for DeJounte Murray would have cost the Jazz Keontae George, and they weren't interested in doing that. That doesn't mean they were, willing to include Walker Kessler or Taylor Hendricks. Right now, I think the Jazz probably get more value out of just, waiting and seeing what those guys can turn into. But if the right trade comes along and you have to include a young player, I don't know who on the Jazz would be quote-unquote untradeable for the right type of piece. If Giannis is coming back, obviously, you would include just about anybody to get that deal done. I just don't expect that to become likely this summer. I could see the Jazz, honestly, including any of these young guys. I could see Bryce Sensabaugh being in this conversation. I could see Keontae George being in this conversation. I could see Taylor Hendricks being involved in these conversations. I could definitely see Walker Kessler being involved in the right move for the right team, because I think there are teams out there that are going to be looking to add centers that may just not be on the board when they're drafting. So like a team like Oklahoma City, who needs to add a big guy, probably doesn't want to disrupt their culture, so they don't necessarily need somebody to step in right away to demand touches, etc., but could add some size and some rim protection for them. I've always thought Oklahoma City would make some sense for Walker Kessler if both teams decided one needed a center and the Jazz wanted to change the direction. And I've not heard that the Jazz want to move off of Walker Kessler at all. I think you heard Will Hardy at the end of the season say he liked Walker Kessler and they were excited about what he had done. And certainly year 2 wasn't what they had hoped after year 1, but they like where he is as an average coming out of 2 seasons as a second-year player, now going into year 3. So we'll see what kind of jump he can make this summer with the expectation that he's going to be a part of the team's summer league roster and be healthy, which is just not something he's had the advantage of doing in his first 2 years with the Jazz. So I could see Oklahoma City maybe being a destination, if they wanted to float their lottery pick. That would be a little bit interesting to me if the Jazz felt like there was a guy on the board like a Kyle Filipowski who they thought made more sense with what they're trying to do next to Lauri Markkanen, more so than Walker Kessler did. And the Thunder wanted a bit more of a ready product who can step in and play right away and doesn't have to be a star but can come off the bench and produce and be a rim protector. I think there's some sense in that. So I don't know if that fully answers your question of who I would include, but where I could see the Jazz going, where none of the young players are truly untouchable, and then maybe what you could expect if a team were to call on some of the Jazz young players, what they might be looking to get back in return. Utah Jazz news. Any reports of who the Jazz like in the draft if they were to draft a player? I mean, I do think they're going to draft a player. I have not heard specifics on who the Jazz like of the draft people I have talked to, and we are getting closer into this conversation. I know, outside of Danny Ainge saying very publicly that he liked Zach Edey and thought Zach Edey was going to be a good player, which I wouldn't write off as nothing. Maybe the Jazz find a way to get Zach Edey on draft night, especially if he's there at 29. I think that would be a very easy pick. I don't think he ends up falling there. But I have not heard specifics on who the Jazz like, though Danny Ainge has talked about liking some players, not knowing if they were going to be on the board at 10. I actually think that's pretty fascinating because when he said that, several of the names that are now projected to go in the top 10, Tajane Saloon is a name specifically that was not projected to be in this conversation. Devin Carter's jumping up draft boards. Not names that were expected to be drafted in the top 10. Might push a couple of other people down. So maybe these guys who the Jazz didn't think were going to be there, and Danny Ainge was saying this even before the lottery, so he was even talking about at 8, some of the guys they didn't know if they'd be available. Maybe they are available at 10, and they weren't expecting that. So I could absolutely see the Jazz liking players, and look, if they want to move up, I think they're going to have that ability to. That feeds into our next question from Jared. Jared, I've seen the rumors about combining the 10th and the 29th pick to trade for a star or maybe move up. Of course, it takes 2 to tango. Are you aware of any other teams that are in a situation where a trade like that would make sense? I think young or old teams or teams that are close to contending are always looking for ways to find affordable talent, and especially more so than ever now, these teams that are high in the salary cap, that are about to get hit really hard with the new tax apron rules that make it hard to combine players in trades. You lose potential first-round draft picks. At least you can't trade them. They get frozen in trades. Could be looking now to make major moves before the financial year kicks in. So I think there is some interest there. So, look at teams like Denver. Look at teams like Minnesota. Look at some of these teams that are close but not quite over-the-top contenders. Not quite. I mean, obviously Denver won a title last year, but teams that are going to have to make decisions on how to improve their roster and don't have a lot of wiggle room. This might be the type of draft where they do try and add a couple of young players or see a guy at 10 they could fall in love with that maybe the Jazz would be willing to take back a more proven veteran piece who's not old but, fits the timeline alongside Lauri Markkanen more so than adding another 19-year-old. I would always keep an eye on that. As far as teams moving up, this is kind of a weird draft because there's a lot of teams that I would identify as like, hey, maybe you could move up to 8 or maybe you could move up to 7
that just have multiple picks already. I mean, Portland has the 7th pick, so maybe you could say, yeah, trade the 10th pick and the 29th pick. The problem is Portland has 7 and 14 already. They don't need to add the 10th pick and the 29th pick. They've already got 2 picks in the lottery. San Antonio is the same way, where maybe you could include 10 and 29 in a traditional draft to move up to the 8th spot, move up 2 picks. This is similar to what happened with Indiana and Washington last year in the draft. And the problem is San Antonio has the 8th pick and the 4th pick. They don't need to add the 10th pick and the 29th pick, I don't think. They don't need more draft capital like that. They also have the 35th pick, so a late first-round pick is probably not that huge of a difference at 29 versus 35. So that probably pulls that off the board. Would Charlotte be willing to move back down? Maybe. They don't necessarily need to get younger. But if there's a guy they think, oh, yeah, he's going to be on the board at 10, that's who we really like, but he's not great value at 6. But we would also like to add a pick late to, add more talent around. Maybe I could see that in the Jazz trying to trade, 32, 29, and 10 to move up a spot to get a player. I kind of think the Jazz would take more swings than that, even if it ends up as, an international player that you let stay over in Europe for a year with one of the later picks, the 29th pick or the 32nd pick. I could certainly see that. Or the Jazz just wanting to see what type of value the 32nd pick has when you have a night before the second round, as they've split the draft into 2 days. Maybe they want to see what type of value that has, and you don't give up that 32nd pick unless there's absolutely a can't-miss trade that you make. Maybe it's valuable to hold on to that asset and see what type of bidders come on Wednesday, June 26th, going into the 27th, the second day of the draft. I think that kind of actually throws a weird wrinkle that might actually freeze the Jazz a little bit in an unusual way, where you would have been willing to make that trade earlier on the first draft night or the only draft night in the past. So those are the only real issues I see that could potentially become a problem. Detroit, I think, is going to want to make their pick. They keep getting stuck at 5th, and they just need more and more elite talent, so I don't see them trading back to 10. It's possible, I guess, but I don't see that being the case. The Jazz pick that they have, number 32 overall, even though it's from the Washington Wizards, actually came from Detroit, and Detroit has already traded their 31st overall pick, the first pick of the second round, to Toronto, so maybe they'd be interested in adding another pick. Maybe that's a team you could keep an eye on at 5 that the Jazz would have to include more than just draft capital to move up. I don't think you can get that high with just 3 draft picks, but there are certainly some options. But again, the problem is San Antonio, who owns 2 picks ahead of the Jazz, Portland, who owns a pick ahead of the Jazz, probably doesn't make a lot of sense for wanting to move down. All right, next question in the mailbag. As always, love you guys sending these in. Always fun to talk about. T first says, what do you think it would cost us to trade Houston for the number 3 overall pick? They have that pick via the Brooklyn Nets, so kind of playing with house money there. They are still a good piece away from making that jump. There's a lot of ties between them and Donovan Clingan. If they believe that's an option, I could still see Alex Sarr, who some people think is going to be the number 1 pick in the draft. I could see him falling to 3, and they need a big man who can play some defense and help, and I think that would be beneficial for them, and I think both those guys would be on the board. Again, that kind of does get the interesting conversation I talked about with Walker Kessler is, do they want a more proven piece who could step in right away? Maybe Walker Kessler would make sense in Houston, and the Jazz could include 10, and that way they still get, a lottery pick. They get a Walker Kessler type who's a little bit less of a question mark, though his upside's not as high as either Alexander Sarr or Donovan Clingan, and I still don't think that's enough, even with, the 3 first-round picks. So you'd probably have to include future draft capital. I don't think there's a player for the Jazz that I would trade to move up to 10. I just don't, or move up from 10 to 3. I just don't think that makes a ton of sense outside of a Walker Kessler. And I'm not advocating for trading Walker, but I'm thinking of what Houston's needs are. And, if the Jazz felt like, they're going to go up and get Donovan Clingan, or they're going to get an Alex Sarr, maybe a more long-term replacement they think has higher upside than Walker does. But then again, if that's the case and the Jazz feel that way, Houston probably does as well, and the Jazz probably aren't able to make that trade. So I wouldn't throw a Colin Sexton into that conversation. I probably wouldn't throw the young players because Keontae George, Bryce Sensabaugh, Taylor Hendricks, all could be better than whoever goes at number 3 in this draft. That is the problem with this draft, is a lot of these guys who are projected to go in those 1, 2, 3, 4 spots aren't much better than the guys that were projected to go 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 last year, which is where the Jazz got Hendricks. And obviously Keontae George, I thought, outplayed his draft position somewhat dramatically. That's why he ended up on one of the all-rookie teams. So that's where the Jazz are. I think that's it for the Jazz mailbag. I can answer Chandler's, the co-host here. He says, which all-time Jazz man, not top 5, would best fit on this current roster? I guess you go with just best player available in that sense. So, you could always use a Carlos Boozer, who's probably not a top 5 player. I think there's a few other names ahead of him that I would put in that conversation. Certainly Darren Williams is not a top 5 player. The Jazz could use a big-bodied point guard. I think Darren is a pretty prototypical player in today's modern NBA and would be really good. Those are 2 interesting names that are probably in the 6, 7, 8 standings of great all-time Jazz players. And then I think the canned answer for this, it's easy, is always Andrei Kirilenko, just because of his very modern style of play. He could play the 4 in today's NBA, which was a lot harder for him to do in the early 2000s when the Jazz were trying to make that work, and we just hadn't quite gone full positionless like we have now. He would certainly look very good next to Lauri Markkanen and that versatile defense, being able to defend some 5s in the NBA, and certainly every other position would be super valuable for the Jazz. So I think that's the name that I would always throw out in that conversation. But there's a lot of good players. Heck, Thurl Bailey would be really good. I mean, Thurl Bailey's 6'9", 6'10", had a sweet jumper. That would be a three-point shot in the NBA, not just an 18-footer. I think his type of size would be pretty intriguing in the modern NBA as well. So there's a lot of interesting names out there that could fit that conversation. That will do it for today's Jazz Notes podcast. We appreciate everybody tuning in. As always, subscribe to the Jazz Notes newsletter. Get this delivered to you before it hits the public. You can find that link at KSLSports.com or really in any Jazz article I write at KSLSports.com, so it's easy to find. You can just subscribe with your email and get it sent to you every Tuesday at 4 o'clock before these articles hit the web. Find me on Twitter at Ben's Hoops. Follow Chandler Holt KSL. Read us at KSLSports.com. We'll be back next week with more Jazz Notes.